And welcome to this edition of the Native News Update on this Monday, April 4th. I'm your host for today's program, Paul DeMain. And today we go directly to Anchorage, Alaska, to Alaska Public Radio Network's news director, Lori Townsend, to get an update on some of the news from that end of the world. Lori Townsend, there's always seems to be a lot going on up in Alaska. Give us a little bit of an idea of what's happening up on your end of the earth there. Let's start talking a little bit about where we left off the last time we talked to you about the Iditarod and where our Alaskan native mushers were. Tell us the results of that this year's race.
Sure, Paul. Hi. Happy Monday. And the Iditarod, although it's been over now for a while, it was a very exciting race, as it is every year. This year, John Baker, a Kotzebue Alaska Native musher, won the race. And John has been running the race since 1996. He started mushing in 95. He ran his first Iditarod in 96. And he's ran the race 16 times. He's really a popular musher in not only Kotzebue, but in a lot of parts of the state. And so people were really happy that he won finally this year. He's finished in the top 10 a number of times, but he finally not only won the race, but he shattered the record by 3 hours. He ran in 8 days, 19 hours and 46 minutes, and broke the record by 3 hours, which is quite a bit. So people were really happy about that. John has a very fast team, and the conditions were right. And when he got to the river and was on the last stretch and then out on the coast, he was able to just really fly along and won the race. So it was an exciting Iditarod, and John Baker, Alaska Native musher from Kotzebue, was the winner.
He comes from a family of mushers, it sounds like.
Well, that I'm not sure about.
Okay.
I know that his family runs Baker Air Service up north, and he's been involved for many, many years, and I'm not sure about his family, though.
Okay. Well, I would assume that in his village there are lots of people who don't necessarily mush for races, but it's a common tool utilized, or was at one point. I know everyone's into their machines nowadays. He grew up around this stuff.
Absolutely. And, mushing has kind of ebbed and flowed for years. It's difficult to keep a team of dogs. It's very expensive. And so it takes a lot of work just to keep them fed. If you're not buying commercial dog food, if you're feeding them salmon or hunting for them, it takes a lot of work to keep a team fed and to work with them all the time. So it's nice to see sort of a revitalization of younger people getting into mushing, because there were lots of young mushers and some kind of rising stars that we're seeing here in Alaska. And so it's great that it's thriving, and there's a lot of interest here in the state, and a lot of young people getting involved.
Yeah. Almost seems to me as it's kind of an art of survival from the beginning to end, being 8 days. It ended up around March 14th, 15th, something like that. So it's about 2 weeks that came in, but we haven't talked to you since before that race was started.
John won on the 15th. That was the day he came in.
Yeah, okay. But let's talk a little bit about the dynamics of some of that stuff I was reading here, that all of a sudden in parts of Alaska you have beaver. They call them the world's largest rodent, which is beginning to set up households, or whatever you want to call it, lodges on a particular river, but it's just one of several signs of global warming. Tell us a little bit more. You said there was something about some coastal water level projections came out. Tell us about that.
Yes, we just had a story last week that you can find on our website, APRN.org, new or revised predictions about sea level rise. They're calling for 3 feet by 2100, which is pretty astounding. And up to 9% of American coastal areas, cities will have their land, 9% of their land will be impacted. And so we're seeing that the federal government, although they're not, lawmakers might still be trying to argue about climate change, but federal agencies are sort of quietly starting to look at adaptation and how to deal with what is already occurring. And in Alaska, we see so much of that with coastal erosion. And as you mentioned, the Woolwich River and beavers moving in there in an area where they had not been before. And the concern over the fact that this is Kivalina's fresh water supply, and there's concerns about contamination of that water supply. And so it's just one of those signs that climate change is certainly real and is happening and impacts things in ways that people just aren't fully engaged in understanding. Subtle things such as changes in game migration patterns and just where wildlife lives as opposed to where it may have lived 10 or 15 years ago.
Well, and I was reading here that there was cellars that people were using for storage of goods that are now thawing of ice cellars used to store food, disruption of utilities, and so forth. And the tie between a native village in Louisiana, long ways from Alaska, that's being washed away. And my understanding is there are some villages up there who are conferring with each other about the need to talk about coastal water levels rising and what it means to those villages that are on the edge. You have a couple villages up there that are being relocated already. They're beginning to relocate some villages down in Louisiana as well, post Katrina, but the rising levels is what's causing the extensive flooding. There are communities that are basically underwater there, other than a few holdouts in Louisiana.
Well, and there's a archaeological site here in the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta that is it's a village site called Nanakluk. I'm not pronouncing that properly, but it's close. And that means old village site. It's near Quinnahock in the YK Delta region. And it's such a rich archaeological site, and researchers and people that are working out there are scrambling to recover as much as they can because erosion is happening so fast and things are washing away so fast that they're really trying to learn as much as they can before more of it's gone. And we've seen that in Barrow. The old site at Point Barrow has been eroding very, very quickly. When I was there a couple of years ago, one of the archaeologists told me that they figured that the main site is now about 2 miles out into the ocean. So much has eroded away. And coastal erosion is such a big issue here in Alaska because of the great expense at trying to move a village, sometimes of fewer than 100 people, and trying to help the federal government understand why it should be so expensive to move 90 or 120 people is very difficult for lawmakers who haven't seen the areas that we're talking about, how remote they are and how difficult it is to get building supplies and things to these areas. So it's a terrible issue here for coastal communities, people who need to move, maybe are in a village because the infrastructure was put in place by school officials and missionaries who said, you're not going to be able to move seasonally, you're going to have to stay in one place because we're going to build a school. Well, they built these schools in places that now are washing into the sea. And so it's
Indeed.
a huge issue here.
I think people on Manhattan Island ought to be keeping an eye on what's happening in Louisiana and Alaska.
Absolutely. I've thought about that with the Florida Keys. I haven't been to the Florida Keys, and I feel like I should go soon because these areas are going to be in trouble in the next decade, I would say.
Okay. You got a couple other issues in the last 4 or 5 minutes of the program here today. You wanted to talk a little bit about the Alaska Claims Act, their settlement.
Yes. Yeah, there's been a series of panel discussions taking place. ANCSA at 40, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, is 40 years old, and Nellie Moore, formerly of National Native News and Independent Native News, and longtime Alaska Native journalist here in Alaska, has been moderating these panels, helping with this discussion. And the panel that will be held Friday night is about how the Alaska pipeline, the TAPS line, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System, and ANCSA are some people say the pipeline couldn't have happened without the Claims Settlement Act, and other people say the Claims Settlement Act couldn't have happened without the pipeline. So it'll be a discussion about those things on Friday night. I'm really looking forward to being there.
Friday, April 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th. 8th, I believe.
April 8th, thank you.
Okay.
I know it's Friday night, but I wasn't entirely sure about the date. Yes, this coming Friday night, and I'll be able to tell you more about that next week when we talk. And I also wanted to mention, Paul, that the governor here, Sean Parnell, one of the big platforms that he ran on as when he was running for governor was ending domestic violence and sexual assault in Alaska. That's an issue that's very close to him. He feels very strongly about it and has pushed this. And just this Thursday, the 31st, this last Thursday, the governor held Choose Respect is the name of his campaign. And he orchestrated rallies in 60 communities across the state, led by his commissioners and other state officials. And the governor himself led the rally in Anchorage. And there were a lot of Alaska Native folks out in front with hand drums, men leading the way with hand drums for the rally in Anchorage, and just putting that message out there. And I interviewed the governor about it and asked him, there's people that criticize this, saying, you can't tell a predator to just choose respect. It's an oversimplification, sort of like Nancy Reagan's "just say no to drugs" idea.
Sure.
And I said, are you trying to reach the next generation of men, or are you still hoping to stop people who don't choose respect from making bad choices? And he made a very compelling argument for trying to reach out to both. And he said another thing that he really wants to do is let people that have been assaulted know that they don't have to be ashamed. They don't have to feel bad. They should let folks know what's happened to them. And so that was part of his initiative too. And so he makes a real compelling case about ending domestic violence and sexual assault in Alaska, where we're always either leading the nation or in the top 3 or 4 for that dubious distinction.
Big issue in Indian country, and Denise Pictou-Maloney recently compared the issue of her mother's murder and the cover-up by male members of the American Indian movement as one of those situations that was allowed to occur simply because the silence in our community towards domestic abuse and abuse against women, that was part of the environment that allowed that murder case to go unresolved for 35 years. Good message. We'd like to ask your governor if he wouldn't mind giving a call to our governor and make a note about that issue of respect versus disrespect going on. And second of all, can you tell people where those hearings are going to be? We do have people who watch this in Alaska who might be interested in those hearings that are coming up Friday. Where's the location for
Absolutely. It's a panel discussion, and it will be held at the University of Alaska Anchorage UAA campus in the Rasmussen Hall. And I think they're at 7 o'clock Friday evening. And people are definitely welcome to come to the panel. And I would imagine that they make time at the end of it for question and answer after the panelists get done with their formal comments.
Lori,
that's Friday night.
Well, thanks for joining with us today. We're out of time. Where can people go to get this material, then these shows and everything?
They can find all of these stories and more at APRN.org.
Thank you for joining with us again. Miigwech.
Thanks, Paul.
And that is the latest roundup of news from Indian Country on this edition of the Native News Update. We want to thank you for joining in with us today and come back again soon. Miigwech.